we already do actually have a question from Jessica Zhu in the question Q&A box. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to pull it up right here for myself, so I have it in front of me, which says, to what extent are categories like Jainism, Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, mysticism, asceticism, and so on useful in this new mode of doing comparative theology? Can we move away from presumed fixed traditions and into more relational accountabilities and ask how senses of traditions emerge? If so, what are some of the useful ways to do comparison when the relatas, aka traditions, are dissolved into relations in flux? It's a very good question to kick us off here. So I don't know if Professor Mehta or Barbato, if you wanted to address that question.
Yeah, I can say something on that. Thank you very much for the question. It brought me right back to the interviews I did during my doctoral research in India when I spoke to people about what Anekantavada means to them as part of their identity as Jains. And quite a few times I received a response from Jain interview partners who didn't want to be fenced into an identity as belonging, being members of a religion, Jainism. They said, like, my religion is not an ism, my religion is ahimsa. That it was matters to me. So I think in that sense, labels can hinder true truth-seeking and conversation. And many chains express a critical attitude to that form of religious labeling and group thinking. At the other thing, we have to examine, I think, what we mean by religious identity, because relationality also means that we are not just individuals in flux. In some way, there are coherent identity structures that bind us together. So being a Jain is not just limiting, it is also relational, or being a Christian. It means we belong to that tradition that extends through time. And there is a term used for Jain identity that it is about flexible fundamentalism. Here, not fundamentalism, not meant in a bad way, but actually in a positive way, that it has survived through such a long time because it had this core belief in ahimsa that it really stays faithful to, while at the same time being very flexible and adapting to the conversations it enters with different worldviews, with different political systems, and with different cultural settings. So I think the flexibility can also be part of an identity. And so I think it's kind of both. In the one sense, it can be limiting. In the other sense, it can be in itself relational. So we have to keep both sides in mind and neither discard nor solidify these kind of categories, but always remain open to questioning and to seeing what kind of implications it brings into the discussions. Thank you again for that question.
Professor Mehta, thank you, Professor Barbato. Professor Mehta, did you want to answer that?
No, I think that was perfect.
Great. So there are a few more questions in here. One of them from Nicole that I think brings up a topic I think is interesting and maybe you want to expand and elaborate on is the simple and good question: is Jainism pantheistic? And also what I was thinking about in relation to that as you were going through your presentation is you touched on it a little bit. I think Melanie did. Tell us a little bit more what you mean by theology when we are thinking about Jain comparative theology, the word theology itself, with regard to Jainism's position on a god. I don't know who wants to take that. I know that Professor Barbato, you had mentioned it. But...
I'm fine with continuing that, but also I would like to give the first part to Professor Mehta, if she likes.
Dr. Barbato, please continue.
Okay, yeah. So yes, I think we should be careful not to speak without thinking of Jainism, a Jain theology. There are certainly ways in which philosophy is in many ways a better way of thinking. And I think that also comes across in our volume, that there is a shift toward maybe more wisdom or more philosophical thinking rather than a God being the ultimate focus. But then at the same time, chapters like by my colleague Professor Mehta show that it's also an oversimplification to keep the devotional aspect out of Jainism. So it's again about bringing the nuance of these traditions into the discussion. about how to classify Jainism in terms of these theistic, non-theistic, monotheistic terms. There is one term that has been used in German Indology for Jainism that is transtheistic, and it means in a way that there are supernatural beings, like they can be called gods, but that is obviously like a helping device from European languages, but they are not the same as the creator God. So there are supernatural beings, but they are not required for salvation. So they are ultimately not the ones that get you out of the cycle of rebirth. So I think it's important here to again look at the nuance of the function of these different categories of beings and what we orient ourselves towards. So this is, I think, a very interesting point for comparison and for really going in small steps to see how do people relate to these aspects across traditions.
And that's a great way to perhaps pivot then to you, Professor Mehta. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that before I ask the next question.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, why, Dr. Miller, if it's allowed, why don't I answer to the next question from Nicole about Padmavati and I include my response. And sorry if you can hear the vacuum cleaner upstairs. It's a like weekend and cleaning day for my neighbors. So Padmavati is Padmavati similar to Sophia or Barbato? So Padmavati is technically Yakshi, as Dr. Barbato explains that there are different categories of divinity and divine supernatural figures that Jainism recognizes as a part of like larger pantheon, deities pantheon or pantheon. But Padmavati in a very lay language is a kind of a nature being that now we also call supernatural power. Somebody, a deity with its supernatural power. She is very feminine, but she is not very similar to Sophia in a sense that they are not considered to be like mother or the creator of something. But that is a very scriptural, conventional understanding that Jainism itself has brought out to the world. But then what happens to Padmavati, figures like Padmavati, Yakshis, the attendant deities to the Tirthankaras, the Jinnas, right? The liberated ones. What happens when she's been introduced and reproduced and recreated by the devotees, Jain lay people, her profile changes. And I'm so glad that there is no definite biography of Padmavati within the Jain literature. And these Jains are writing that, and each writes their own description of Padmavati. And that is perhaps that the comparative theology and Anekantavad in practice by the Jains. So that's how divinity, the concept of God, is seen within this structure. And we are very happy that we are trying to address this. We're trying to enhance this in conversation in this volume, comparative theology. And now, I'm sure that all other our authors have done that. But then I'm glad that I could bring in the Hindu lens to kind of read again back reading the Jain concept of Padmavati and the goddesses and divinity and coming back. So maybe the understandings are different, understandings are changing, and that's how Anekantavad remains in practice.
Wonderful answer. Following what Professor Barbato had said about transtheistic, this germ coming from the translation of the German term, I can really see how the example of Padmavati illustrates that so richly. And by the way, thank you for your wonderful painting and illustrating for us Anekantavada through the image of your painting. But I can really see how the way that you're showing both your own engagement with Padmavati as well as Jain engagements with Padmavati, broadly speaking, not just your own, represent that kind of transtheistic experience that nevertheless somehow remains Jain, right? And it at the same time does not deny the reality of the other's existence. And in that regard, this is a question that bounces off of what Barbato said at the beginning, what you said, Professor Barbato, that I also think will then relate to Jessica's question, which I'll ask in a moment, that I see here in the chat, which is that you pointed out very rightly so, I think, that comparison has a kind of colonial violence built into it, or it has had a kind of colonial violence built into it. Part of the comparative project in some of the early roots in, for example, some of the Jain ethnography that I read, the ethnography of the Jains that I read in colonial encounters is quite violent in its sort of structuring of the Jain religious tradition in a way that demotes it, berates it, makes fun of it, you name it, right? It's there. So it becomes in its roots, a comparative project. And I know that's not what you're doing. My question is then, and I'm thinking with John Court's article here, where he points out that Anekantavada was not originally a form of intellectual nonviolence. And in fact, in some ways, it seems when I read the philosophy in that article and other places that the Jains were in some ways trying to structure the omniscience of the Jinnas as the kind of superior or whatever, however he puts it in his article, position, right? So how does doing a Jain comparative theology today that engages with Anekantavada simultaneously avoid reproducing that kind of, I don't want to call it harm, but that kind of hierarchy, the creating of a hierarchy within the comparative project?
Can I start to answer on that?
Absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I think I totally acknowledge that, and I think we also should not go into any kind of theological or philosophical project with like an overly romantic idea of what one tradition does better than the other. I think it's good to engage in all of such projects with like a self-critical attitude. So I think that is like something that if we want to do true learning, then it also requires questioning our own approaches. So yeah, not just presenting Anekantavada as a like concept that is completely the solution to violent Western epistemic frameworks. But thank you for also pointing out that apologetic aspect, which doesn't have to be wrong always, but Anekantavada also served like a defensive function in a way in formalized contests of debate and so on. So it had like a structural function in there. And if we are honest about the position that was often given to other communities, that was a form of inclusivism, like appreciating but subordinating in a way their views. So, but at the same time, I think we can find solutions to that within the Jain view itself again, which is something I really appreciate, is that dual existence of, on the one hand, the high respect or veneration given to the omniscient. So the idea that in Jainism that you can really achieve complete knowledge of all things at all time, like that as the ideal, which is like I think a very noble and beautiful ideal to strive to that complete knowledge. But at the same time, that awareness that most of us, as we are here, we are nowhere near to these omniscient. We are very humble. So for ourselves, it's certainly not adequate to compare ourselves to the all-seeing person who already has that overview over our systems. So maybe one step I would say spontaneously from you would be to not identify oneself with the seeing person in the elephant parable, but to see that all of us are actually more like the blind people, and not to claim that through one's tradition one is automatically superior, but that we are all human beings trying to learn together. So that would be my response to that.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
that kind of a humility there in acknowledging that, and at the same time recognizing the power of this tool of Anekantavada and what it could do for Jain comparative theology nonetheless. Thank you, Professor Barbato. Professor Mehta, were you going to comment on that?
I would my response would be very similar to Dr. Barbato's response. I will just add one thing, and I might speak from my Jain perspective as a practitioner, would be that in Jainism, the worship, the devotion, the respect to the Tirthankaras and Jinas, the omniscient being, goes in a way that the Jain would worship the ideals that they carried and taught. If Jains would say that, like, maybe I will go ahead and work on my soul and my body to be as non-violent as they were in their life and go closer to remain, to become an omniscient. If that can happen with ahimsa, why that cannot happen with anekant? If you can just see the two parts of the body of elephant, maybe after a few years, four part, six part, and not why only elephant? There are many animals around as well, right? So maybe the parable can go ahead and say that, like, let's say this is elephant, but there is also a lion. Let's see how, let's compare. So I would say that like Anikant can also be like ahimsa, get closer to how the Tirthankaras have taught us their ideals. And if you want to be like them in as many as lifetime it can take as a human, but we can do that. So I would say that it's uh, Dr. Miller, to go to your question about the hierarchy, it's not about hierarchy. It's about like the epitome. It's like kind of an ultimate goal that is more beautifully aligned to the sentiment of humility that Anikant can give us. And I'm very sure that Dr. Long would talk more about this as we will hear him. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. This is a question and a conversation that we've had so many times in different venues, including with other talks that Professor Long has given and others on our platform. So I appreciate both of your responses, which are quite original and add some new flavor to the way that we're thinking about this. And I particularly appreciate that, Professor John Cord also wrote an article about studying Jainism and then studying the Jains. And I think very much in some ways Anekantavada is Jainism in the fact that it is part of its scriptural tradition. That's what he meant by that, was they have this scriptural tradition. And then there's the Jains, which is the living reality of how Jains then engage with that ever-changing scriptural tradition, right? That is always evolving and adapting to its present times and engaging with its social realities, as we discussed so much here at Arihanta Institute. And so I can really see that through that framework of looking at it as a living tradition, an evolving and changing tradition, that we can also see how it's being readapted in its diasporic contents as well as in India as well. So Jessica asked a really good question that has to do with this, the violence, I think, of comparison and what ends up happening. But let me just try to summarize it. It's a bit of a long question that points towards how Buddhist and Taoist and other texts kind of have this ideal of egalitarianism, of non-hierarchical society, of processual relational thinking. And if we have these rich theological toolboxes for building a democratic society, especially in early Buddhist communities and in the Jain community as well, or some kind of relational non-denomination, why in practice, here's the question, do we keep producing different kinds of hierarchies and creating these hells for each other? How do we deal with this recurring paradox of hoping for X but acting to reproducing not X? And I think it's a historical question in some ways, sociological question. I don't know if either of you want to respond to that from the Jain historical or any perspective, really.
Yeah, I can just say a few words on a very general context. It reminds me just of the very general social reality that already Max Weber has observed about the way that institutions form and social systems work. Like he says that we begin with a charismatic leadership, but then for example, the Buddha or Jesus, who like really questions social structures and works for a more just way of living that flattens these hierarchies. But then people at that time, they will leave maybe their home, they will give up their job, they will follow. But very soon, that community, after the death of the leader, will try to find new structures that allow an everyday life. In German, it is Veralltäglichung or routinization. So that idea is that institution building starts then, and that the transfer of authority, it gets regulated at either through election or through birthright and so on. So that human beings anywhere have that tendency, after a religious figure comes and really shakes up things, to fall back into these routine movements. And I think it doesn't always just have to be a bad thing, because people want families, they want to get on with their life. But at the same time, we can remind ourselves that we need new impulses of fresh ideas for breaking up these solidified structures again. And maybe also from that, I would say, to have an openness towards movements that question the status quo. In Germany, we have very easily that term like a sect. It used to be like what is said for anything that is not like the mainstream church. But I think some religious vitality and diversity, it's a good thing. So we cannot predict how things always go, but I think it's always that tension between new ideas, radical living, extreme asceticism, but then the broad majority of people who want to live a normal everyday life with job and family. So most religion provide actually both paths alongside, and I think Jainism was also one of them.
Yeah, a wonderful kind of way to pull that into a different theoretical framework that's really looking at it sociologically and what happens. I mean, even right now, this is in the context of engaged Jain studies, we're seeing how former leaders who promise, you know, this utopia in their kind of political campaigns, and then who kind of turn around from that and end up becoming dictators. Eventually, they get pushed out of power, right? We just saw it recently happen in Hungary, for example. And when these kinds of things happen, it kind of reflects that dynamic that you're describing in some ways with higher social hierarchies, and then the reemergence of some kind of non-hierarchical society that, you know, from the Jain perspective, I suppose we're going through these cosmic cycles and repeating these things of history and political, religious, and all sorts of ways. So thank you for answering that. I have another question really quickly for you all, which is that we're in the context of engaged Jain studies and engaged Anekantavada. And with regard to your volume in particular, besides the clear academic contribution that you're both making, that all three of you are making, Alan Brill will be here with us tomorrow, and all the contributors are making, is there some kind of takeaway that you want the readers to get, maybe not just within the academy, but outside the academy? Is there something that if someone who was a member of the Jain community or just an interested, curious reader had, what is it that you would want them to take away from a kind of engaged Jainism perspective? What's the message here? What's the hope that your volume really conveys? I mean, I think I see some of it, of course, and our audience might see some of it, but is there something else you want to say about what some takeaways will be from this volume? Professor Mehta, did you want to start on that one?
No, I would request Dr. Barbato to start, and maybe
Okay.
I'll add a few lines.
Okay, yes, I can say a chapter that I co-wrote was an Orthodox theologian, and I really liked the reaction because at first we discussed about he's working on eco-theology in Orthodox Christianity, and then by looking at the Ahimsa teaching in Jainism, he said about how Orthodox Christians can get confidence in the very difficult political situation that they have currently with Ukraine and Russia and so on, which involves many Orthodox Christians being on the side of war, others opposed to war, to actually rediscover their own stories of nonviolence. Because there's one story about an Orthodox Christian monk who killed a fly and was then weeping for several days, feeling sad, and that to connect to Jain stories in a way of spiritual brotherhood, one can say, when there is that feeling of isolation in the world and sometimes despair. I think it's also about finding new parallels, not just in an intellectual way, but also in a way of still hoping for a gentler and more peaceful world, which can resonate with people, so that having interreligious conversations, it can really give courage and hope to each other in times that are not always easy.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just quickly add, because this question is about like what people outside of academia would like to learn and what would like to give as a like takeaway from our book. Maybe I'm like oversimplifying it, but most of our understanding, our perspectives, and our experience are developed through our religious traditions, our faith understanding, and how we see relationship between us and our divine figures. What if we can add another tradition and see, like, what our neighbors are doing, what our distant neighbors are doing, what someone who is like completely unfamiliar to us are doing, and learning from their perspective and see how things are there. So, that any extra knowledge, a comparative knowledge would not harm, but to add some intellectual humility, understanding. And that is, of course, all right if there are questions, there are discussions, there are conversations and arguments. And so I guess that can be a very kind of an intellectual food that, you would like. And keeping, kind of fasting on any sort of like violent thought, but like, eating, kind of doing an iambil with like lots of intellectual food from other traditions, then that can be our, for a non-academic reader, would be our contribution to them.
Well, thank you, Professor Mehta and Professor Barbato. This has been a really insightful and great way to start off this conference to get an overview of the volume Jainism and Comparative Theology, a Multi-Religious Approach. We are going to move on to the next panel simply in the interest of time, but I give you a round of applause from the audience around the world, and we're really looking forward to hearing from your contributors to see specifically the ways that the methodology and the very groundbreaking work that you're doing in this volume is going to manifest. And we're very excited about that. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for your questions and participation.